Knowledge and moral obligation. After thinking about what real-life situation I thought invoked deeper analysis, I landed on a cheating scandal that occurred at my school last year in the online calculus BC class. The teacher last year had unknowingly opened the test for all students 2 hours before the students were supposed to report to class and take it, which then allowed nearly every student time to look over the test beforehand. Later investigations showed that nearly every student had opened the test. Despite not all of them cheating, there was never a reported error to the school until the cheating was found out. This led me to question, were they morally obligated to report the incident beforehand? Due to no one reporting it, many students were allowed to cheat freely, which ultimately led to more consequences. This leads to the question of, are the students who acknowledged the test was open and did nothing just as guilty as those who cheated? Did knowing the test was open require action from all involved to report it? Questioning whether or not having knowledge has moral obligation attached to it is an important part of knowing, because action and compliance can have greater impacts outside of the individual. Knowledge can, in part, have impacts outside of the self whether or not the knowledge is shared. Judgment on how to deal with knowledge creates this idea of, what are other people obligated to know and what am I obligated to share with others? This leads to the concept of, to what extent my possession of knowledge carry with it moral obligations. While internally deciding what knowledge is best to share and best to keep, to fully understand this question, we must first unpack the idea of moral obligation. For the purpose of this presentation, moral obligation will be defined as a combination of the goodness of the effect of an action and the goodness of the act itself, as stated in the novel Moral Writings by H.A. Pritchard and Jim McAdam. In this case, the action will be sharing or withholding of knowledge, which is dependent on the situation at hand, given different effects occur in different areas or types of knowledge. It is also important to note how knowledge and obligation are connected. Knowledge carries with it moral obligations when the knowledge can cause unfair advantages, help others, or harm others. These situations are related to almost all kinds of knowledge and can have different obligations attached to them. Whether or not the obligation in question is to remain silent or speak out is negligible, because in either case the proper morality dictates what the personal obligation is, meaning there can be a shift in how to act. Firstly, we will analyze the area of knowledge, math. In math, it can be difficult to see how simple facts can have a moral obligation to them. This is, in part, true, because having general knowledge in math does not have as direct an impact on the lives of others when compared to other areas of knowledge, such as human sciences. However, it is what we do with our mathematical knowledge that has a moral obligation, specifically pertaining to the applications and implications for society at large. When studying math, breakthroughs that could change or create new laws within the subject can hold moral obligation, given the ultimate effect that would occur after the action. Specifically, Isaac Newton is a relevant example of this concept. While trying to perfect physics, Isaac Newton discovered calculus as a way to explain and solve the problems he was uncovering. He did not make this known on the global stage until years afterward, because he felt it wasn't as important as the breakthroughs in physics. Calculus has helped make a pathway to explain and discover more areas within math and naturally occurring events on Earth, such as the natural growth curve. But Newton did not see a pressing reason to share his discovery. Despite his opposition to sharing, this knowledge did in fact carry with it a moral obligation to society, because sharing his discovery would have improved understanding of infinitely more concepts. Although no one knew of his discovery and therefore were not necessarily in search of advancements, and the obligation would then be minimal from an external view, keeping this discovery private would be morally wrong in terms of pushing forth society. This brings up a key counter to how math can be related to moral obligation. Since morals are oftentimes influenced by societal ethics, and no one knew there was knowledge to be shared, how could Newton be obligated to share it? Even if the moral obligation tied with the knowledge is not explicitly known or seen, it does not disrupt its existence. Moral obligation is tied to the goodness of the effect of the action, and in this case, the action of sharing the principles of calculus would have opened pathways in engineering that enabled technological expansion and improvement at an earlier date. Although Newton could not have foreseen these direct impacts, a discovery that is completely one of a kind cannot be understated in its possible implementations. Therefore, the knowledge itself had a moral obligation to share itself with the public. This demonstrates how teaching and spreading information is the key relationship between math and morality. Although this connection is not as prominent as in other areas of knowledge, discoveries are linked to the moral obligation of sharing them with the public. In contrast, we will be looking at human sciences. Moral obligation in this area of knowledge relates to the goodness of the act of telling versus not telling, and how much the knowledge will help or hurt other people. When presented with knowledge about other people, whether it is in a scientific light or a personal one, there is a moral obligation involved in what is the best course of action. We can become unsure in what is best to do because of the direct impact this knowledge can have, as opposed to theoretical ramifications. Obtaining knowledge about the mind, once again, whether for personal or scientific conditions, is intrinsically linked to at least one other person. The fact that knowledge is linked beyond itself implies an obligation in how to act. In psychological testing, when a breakthrough about how the brain works is uncovered, the knowledge has a moral obligation to inform the public because this could change how we interact, see each other, learn, etc. When psychologically analyzing other people in a therapy setting, the therapist becomes support for the patient and must abide by a professional code of ethics to protect the confidentiality of information pertaining to their clients. This knowledge is a prime example of how knowledge in human sciences cannot exist simply for itself and has connection to others. With this connection, the therapist has a moral and lawful obligation to help the patient to the best of their ability. However, sometimes moral obligation can be disconnected from lawful obligation. For example, if a therapist is told that their patient is physically abused by a family member, but the patient is over 18 years of age, lawfully, the therapist is not required to report the abuser. Conversely, the moral obligation would be to call the police to assist the patient rather than standing on the side. In this case, the act of breaking lawful obligation for the pursuit of the good effect for the patient demonstrates how the power of knowledge about others shifts what is morally obligated to do. Choosing to stay silent, though legally all right, defeats the moral obligation accompanying the knowledge because silence brings more harm than good. Knowledge about others has the most inherent impact on a moral scale because the way in which we interact hinges on our knowledge of each other. For the therapist in the example, the fate of the patient's life can be changed by revealing the knowledge because the link between moral actions and what the therapist knows directly influence them. Although not every piece of knowledge has the same type or extent of moral obligation, we as human beings owe each other some level of goodness, and this is where knowledge derives its obligation. Whether or not we see fit to oblige to the moral actions instituted by the knowledge is irrelevant, because the connection itself remains in existence, demonstrating how many avenues of knowledge cannot escape morality. How can this relate to the real world? Moral obligation within knowledge becomes a consistent gray area because there is no knowledge that does not have some sort of moral obligation, even if the obligation itself is swept aside. The differing degrees of moral obligation exemplifies the fluidity of ethics and the question that accompanies moral obligation in any scenario, whether we should listen to it or not. In the calculus BC example, the knowledge that the test was open early did imply a necessity to report the incident, as this action would have had a better result overall. Although the moral obligation was ignored, the knowledge had actions inherently associated with it, hence having to report it. Outside of this example, the entanglement of moral obligation and knowledge is apparent for teachers. Teachers are obligated to give their students new knowledge and truth to the best of their ability, even when the information could offend students in the room or is a hot-button issue. Morally, a teacher is supposed to be there for their students, demonstrating that the knowledge they have about a particular subject is meant to be shared. Even if this knowledge contradicts with either the teacher's personal beliefs or the beliefs of a particular student, they must convey that knowledge in order to remain morally in line with their job description. In some situations, religious or lawful obligation can overtake the moral obligation of the individual. Religious obligation is evident in how priests are bound to confidentiality when told knowledge in confession, even when that knowledge is crime-related. If the confessor had confessed to a crime, the priest in his own individual morals may feel obligated to report the event, but the rules of the church dictate that they cannot directly reveal what was told to them, or they will face excommunication. Although the moral obligation exists, they cannot act on it, showing how morality is so relevant to the knowledge in question. Moral obligation is tied to all types of knowledge, and whether someone chooses to act on it or cannot, the knowledge has inherent actions attached to it that we naturally abide by. As a society, we must see how our knowledge has implications beyond ourselves and what it means to act in moral obligation when learning about the world. Thank you.